first time I truly noticed the radio. It was not because of the sound. It was because of the silence that followed it. I still remember that morning in our village, sometime during the early years of the war, when even the air itself felt like it was holding its breath. We lived in a small house made of old stone and wood, the kind that creaked at night when the wind touched it, as if the house itself was remembering things it didn't want to say out loud. Outside, the fields were still, too still, like even the birds had learned to wait before singing. That was the day the men arrived with the radio equipment. They carried it carefully, like it was something fragile or powerful or both. I stood behind my mother, holding the edge of her shawl, watching as they placed a dark wooden box in the center of the village hall. It didn't look special at first, just a box with a cloth front, a few knobs, a wire that disappeared into the wall like a vein. But the adults, they looked at it differently. They didn't speak much, not the way they usually did when something new came to the village. There was no gossip, no curiosity-filled laughter, only quiet. One of the men turned a switch, and then a sound came. A low crackling first, like distant rain falling on metal roofs. Then a voice slowly emerged from inside the box. Not loud, not emotional, just steady. Attention, attention. That was all it took. Something in the room changed immediately. It wasn't fear exactly. Not yet. It was something softer, something more dangerous than fear. It was attention. Everyone leaned in slightly, as if the voice might disappear if they didn't listen carefully enough. I remember looking around the room and noticing something strange. No one was blinking much, even my mother. The voice continued, speaking about instructions I didn't fully understand at that age. Words like safety, alerts, orders, and timing. The kind of words adults pretend are normal when they are actually holding something heavy behind them. And then it happened. The man beside the radio turned a small knob again. The voice changed tone, not louder, just more serious, as if seriousness itself could be turned like a dial. From that moment, I felt it clearly, though I didn't know how to name it then. The radio was not just speaking to us. It was deciding how we would feel. After a few minutes, the broadcast ended. There was a short burst of static, and then nothing. But the silence that returned was not the same silence as before. It was shaped, like the room had been rearranged without anyone moving. No one spoke immediately. That was the first rule we all learned without being told. Wait after the radio. My mother finally exhaled, slowly, carefully, as if even breathing too loudly might bring the voice back. Outside, the wind moved again, but even it felt cautious. That evening, something new began in our village. People started going home earlier. Candles were lit a little sooner than usual. Children were told to be quieter, not sharply, not angrily, but softly, like it was obvious. And every home without exception, checked one thing before anything else: the radio, not because it was playing, but because it could play. I remember sitting near our kitchen table that night, watching my father adjust the wooden box they had placed in our home. He didn't treat it like furniture. He treated it like responsibility. Every small crackle it made him look up. Every pause made him wait. And I noticed something else that night too. Something I didn't fully understand until much later in life. We stopped asking questions in full sentences. Instead, we began asking fragments. Did you hear? Was that the warning? Do you think it will? And even those fragments faded over time into silence between us. Before I went to sleep, I lay in bed listening, waiting, not for a story, not for comfort, but for the possibility that the box in the other room might speak again. And I realized something very quietly that night. The radio had not yet said anything frightening. It had not warned us of danger. It had not spoken of bombs or fear. And yet, it had already changed the way we lived inside our own home. Outside, the village was dark. Inside, every house was listening, not to each other, but to the possibility of a voice. And as I closed my eyes, I remember thinking in a half-dream state, if a box can tell an entire village when to listen, then perhaps it can also teach us when to be silent. And I don't think any of us understood that fully, not even the adults. Not yet. The night settled slowly after that, and somewhere in the distance, very faintly, the radio in another house clicked once. Just once. And every nearby home seemed to pause at the same time, as if they were all waiting for a voice that hadn't even started speaking yet. The first real fear did not arrive with noise. It arrived with a schedule. It happened a few days after the radio became part of every home in our village. By then, we had already started adjusting our lives around it without anyone formally telling us to do so. Morning felt slightly different because everyone waited a little before speaking too freely. Evening felt heavier because the radio was expected to say something at some point, even if nothing was actually announced. It was as if the entire village had quietly agreed that silence now had meaning. And then came the evening that changed everything. I was sitting near the hearth when the air in our house shifted slightly. My mother noticed it first. She didn't say anything. She simply stood up and adjusted the wick of the lamp, even though it didn't need adjusting. That was her way of preparing without admitting she was preparing. Then the radio crackled. It was not unusual. We heard that sound often. But this time, the crackle lasted longer, long enough for my father to stop what he was doing, long enough for my younger brother to stop chewing his bread, long enough for even the fire to seem less important. And then the voice came. Attention, just like before. But now I recognized it, not as a sound, but as a signal. The tone was different from the first day. Not just serious, but precise, controlled. as if every word had been weighed before being allowed to exist. There was a list of instructions, words I remember even now, though I didn't fully understand them then. Remain indoors. Prepare for alert conditions. Do not gather outside after dusk. Each sentence landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. No one interrupted it. No one questioned it. Not because we agreed, but because it felt impossible to interrupt something that came from inside the box. And then the part that stayed with me forever happened. A pause, a long one, not silence, but expectation. And in that pause, my mother instinctively reached for my hand. She didn't squeeze it hard, just enough to confirm I was still there. Then the voice returned. Air activity may occur tonight. That was the first time I heard that phrase. Not bombs, not danger, not war, just air activity. It sounded almost gentle when spoken through the radio. But inside the room, it didn't feel gentle at all. Something in the village changed that night. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. People began finishing their meals earlier. Candles were placed away from windows instead of near them. Doors were checked twice instead of once. And most importantly, conversations stopped ending naturally. They ended early, like everyone was afraid that finishing a sentence too fully might invite something unwanted. That night, I lay in bed listening to our house breathe. My brother had fallen asleep quickly, as children do when they are too young to hold fear for long. But I was awake, listening, waiting, not for danger exactly, but for instruction. That was the strange thing I began to realize. We were not waiting for events. We were waiting for permission to feel those events. And when I finally heard the radio again later that night, it was not speaking loudly. It was speaking slowly, as if even it understood that fear grows better when it is not rushed. A soft crackle. Then the familiar voice. Remain calm. And somehow those words did not calm us. They organized us. After that night, the village changed in a way no one ever discussed directly. Children began asking less questions. Adults began answering more quickly. And silence started appearing earlier in the evening than darkness itself. I remember one morning after that broadcast, I asked my mother something simple. Why do we listen so carefully now? She paused for a moment before answering. Not because she didn't know, but because she was choosing the safest version of truth she could give me. Because, she said softly, it tells us what the world is doing. But I think even she knew that wasn't the full answer. Because deep down, we were no longer just listening to the world. We were listening to the version of the world that the radio allowed us to hear. And slowly, without realizing it, that became the only version we trusted. As night returned, I noticed something I had not noticed before. The radio didn't just control announcements. It controlled anticipation. Even when it was silent, we expected it. Even when it was off, we listened for it. And as I drifted toward sleep that night, I remember thinking something I could not have fully understood at my age. Fear is not always something that arrives suddenly. Sometimes it is something that is taught softly, one instruction at a time. By the time the next week arrived, something strange had already settled into our village. Not panic, not chaos, something quieter. A kind of agreement no one had spoken aloud. It was the kind of change you only notice when you try to remember how things used to feel and realize you can't quite reach it anymore. The radio had not spoken again with urgency after that night, but it didn't need to. Its presence had already done the work. That evening, I remember sitting outside our house for a few minutes before sunset. The air was cooler than usual, carrying the faint smell of damp wood and distant smoke from cooking fires. Children were still playing, but their voices were lower now. Not silent, just restrained, like they were learning a new language without realizing it. My friend Myra came to sit beside me on the steps. We didn't speak at first. That itself felt normal now. After a while, she whispered, "Do you think it will speak again tonight?" She didn't mean the radio as an object. She meant the voice. I didn't know how to answer, so I just shrugged. Even that felt like enough communication. As the sun lowered, people began going indoors earlier than before. Not quickly, not fearfully, just consistently, like a pattern had replaced choice. Inside our home, my mother lit the lamp at exactly the same time she had the night before. My father adjusted the radio again, even though it was already perfectly tuned. It had become a ritual. The radio sat in its place like it belonged there more than we did. That night, something happened that I still remember very clearly, even though, at the time, it felt almost unimportant. My father spoke less, not because he was upset, not because something was wrong, but because there simply wasn't as much to say. He would begin a sentence, then stop halfway, as if realizing it didn't need to be completed. My mother did the same thing later while preparing food. Even simple comments began dissolving before they reached full form. "Tomorrow we should." She paused, looked at the radio, and then finished differently. "See what is needed." That was the first time I noticed it clearly. We were no longer just responding to the radio. We were adjusting ourselves around the possibility that it might respond. And so we began to conserve words, like they were fuel. That night, I lay in bed listening again, but not for a message this time, for absence, because absence had become meaningful too. At some point after midnight, I heard footsteps outside, not rushed, not loud, just passing. I thought it was strange, because people rarely walked at that hour anymore unless instructed. And then I realized something that made my chest feel slightly tight. The village had started behaving like it was always being observed, even when it was. The next morning, the radio spoke again. It was a short broadcast, clear, controlled, almost polite. maintain standard evening readiness. That was all, but it was enough, because standard had already become something flexible, something we were slowly learning to define through repetition, not explanation. After that message, the village didn't change drastically. It refined itself, like something slowly being sanded down. Children stopped asking loud questions near dusk. Doors closed a little earlier. Even laughter felt slightly softer, as if it had learned to stay within certain limits. I remember one afternoon, I tried to ask my brother why he didn't sing anymore while playing outside. He looked at me like the question itself was unfamiliar. Then he said something very simple. "I don't know if we're supposed to." That sentence stayed with me longer than any broadcast ever did, because no one had told him that. Not directly, not clearly, but somehow he had learned it anyway. That night, something unusual happened. The radio remained silent for longer than expected, long enough that my father actually looked away from it. That alone felt strange, as if looking away from it required permission too. We ate dinner in a different kind of quiet, not uncomfortable, just structured. And then, right before sleep, the radio crackled once. Not a full broadcast, just a single sound, like a reminder that it was still there. And in that moment, something very subtle passed through the house. My mother stopped mid-motion. My father paused without speaking. Even I became still without knowing why. And then nothing followed. No message, no instruction, just silence again. But it wasn't the same silence as before the war. This silence felt aware. As I closed my eyes that night, I remember thinking something I couldn't fully understand yet. We had not been told to stop talking so much. We had simply learned that fewer words made life feel safer. And somewhere between instructions and silence, we had started becoming a village that listened more than it spoke. Not because we were afraid of each other, but because we were slowly learning to wait for a voice that might decide what came next. By the time the next month settled in, I stopped thinking of the radio as something that spoke. It had become something that organized life, not loudly, not visibly, but in the way a river slowly shapes the land without ever announcing what it is doing. The mornings began to feel different first, not because the sun changed, but because we waited before starting our day. There was a pause in every household now, a small, quiet gap between waking up and doing anything else. We would sit, listen, and only then begin. Even if the radio said nothing, that silence itself had become part of the schedule. My father started checking the radio first thing every morning, even before opening the shutters. It was no longer about news. It was about confirmation that the world was still speaking in the same way it had been the day before. At some point, I realized something strange about time itself. We no longer measured it by the sun. We measured it by broadcasts. Morning was not when light arrived. It was when the radio remained silent long enough for us to begin moving. Afternoon was not when shadows grew shorter. It was when we expected another update. Evening was when everyone prepared for the possibility of instruction. Time had stopped being natural. It had become scheduled listening. One day, I remember sitting near the window with my mother while she folded cloth. The light outside was soft, almost golden, and for a brief moment, everything felt ordinary again. I almost forgot the war. Almost. Then I heard it, not the radio itself, but the sound of expectation from the next room. My father adjusting the knob, even though nothing was playing. That small action alone was enough to shift the feeling in the house. My mother didn't look up. She simply said, quietly, "It may speak soon," and then continued folding. That was the moment I understood something I couldn't have explained at the time. The radio didn't need to speak constantly anymore. It only needed to remain possible. And that possibility was enough to structure our entire day. As weeks passed, children began adapting faster than adults. We learned patterns without being taught. If the radio was silent, we could speak more freely. If it had spoken recently, we became careful. If it was expected to speak soon, we became quiet even before it did. It was like living inside a rhythm no one composed, but everyone followed. One afternoon, I noticed something I still remember very clearly. A neighbor passed our house carrying water from the well. She stopped briefly when she heard faint static from inside her home. Just static. No voice. No message. But she still paused, waited, and only then continued walking. That was when I realized the most important shift had already happened. We were no longer reacting to instructions. We were reacting to possibility. That evening, the radio finally spoke again. It was longer this time, more structured, more formal. It gave instructions about timing, safety, and preparation routines. But what struck me wasn't the content. It was how naturally everyone followed it. No confusion, no hesitation, as if the instructions were not new information, but confirmation of something we had already begun doing. After the broadcast ended, my father said something softly while turning the knob back. It helps us know what to do. He said it like it was a comfort, and maybe for him it was. But I remember sitting there, watching the radio go silent again, and feeling something I couldn't fully name. Because I began to understand that when someone else defines your time long enough, you stop feeling the need to define it yourself. That night, I lay in bed listening to the house settle. The usual sounds were there. Wood creaking, wind pressing against the walls, the distant movement of other homes doing the same thing. But underneath all of it, there was always the expectation of sound. The radio had not taken over our conversations. It had taken over our waiting. And waiting, I realized, is where most of life actually happens. Not in speaking, not in acting, but in preparing for what might come next. As I drifted toward sleep, I remember thinking something very softly. If time itself can be guided by a voice we did not choose, then perhaps we are not living in time anymore. Perhaps we are living inside the pauses between instructions. And in those pauses, we are slowly becoming something quieter than we used to be. Something that listens first and remembers later. It happened on a day that looked completely ordinary. That was the first strange thing about it. There were no signs in the sky, no unusual silence in the village, no sense that anything important was about to change. Even the radio sat in its usual place, as if it had already decided the rhythm of the day before we had even woken up. But something broke that rhythm, quietly, without warning. It began in the late morning. I was helping my mother near the kitchen when I heard the first crackle from the next room. It was softer than usual, almost careless, like the radio was clearing its throat instead of preparing to speak. My father immediately stopped what he was doing, not because something had been announced, but because it might be. That was already our habit. We waited, and then the voice came. Attention, the same word we had heard before, but this time something felt slightly off, not in what it said, but in how it said it. There was a delay between phrases that didn't feel intentional. A small hesitation where there usually wasn't one. Still, we listened. It gave instructions as usual, timing guidance, safety reminders, general warnings. But then came the line that would later stay with me longer than anything else in the war. It said there would be an air activity alert window in the early afternoon. That phrase made my father pause slightly. An alert window sounded less certain than before, less final, but still we followed it. As the morning passed, the village adjusted itself again. People went indoors earlier. Work was finished quickly. Children were called back from outside. Everything was becoming familiar in its response, but nothing actually happened. The afternoon arrived, and then slowly passed. No sirens, no distant noise, no sky activity, just normal wind moving through fields. I remember sitting near the doorway with my brother, watching dust move across the road in small spirals. He asked quietly, "Is it still coming?" I didn't know how to answer, because for the first time, the radio had created a moment that did not resolve. The village stayed inside longer than usual, waiting. Not because anyone told us to continue waiting, but because we weren't sure when we were allowed to stop. And then, in the early evening, something changed. My father turned the radio on again, not for news, but for confirmation. The room was already quiet when the voice returned, but this time it was different, slightly faster, less controlled. It repeated the earlier instruction, but with softer certainty, almost as if correcting itself. And then it ended. No apology, no clarification, just silence. That night, something unusual happened in our home. No one commented on the broadcast. Not immediately. Not even my father. He simply sat for a long time looking at the radio, as if waiting for it to explain itself. But it didn't. And that was the first time I saw something I had never seen before. Doubt. Not loud doubt. Not angry doubt. Just a quiet uncertainty sitting in the room. My mother finally spoke later that evening. Very softly. Maybe the timing changed. It was not a challenge to the radio. It was an attempt to keep the world stable. But I could feel it, even as a child. Something had shifted. Because once a system tells you when to expect danger, and that danger doesn't arrive, you begin to learn something new. Not courage, not relief, but interpretation. That night, the village felt different again. Not freer, not safer, just less certain. People still followed instructions, still listened, still waited. But now, there was a small space inside each instruction. A space where doubt could exist without breaking everything. Before sleeping, I heard my father quietly adjust the radio knob again. Not out of obedience, not out of habit, but out of something closer to curiosity. As if he was checking whether it still felt the same. I remember lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. And I realized something very important for the first time. The radio had never been tested before. We had always assumed it was correct, not because it proved itself, but because we had never lived without believing it. And now that it had been wrong just once, we were no longer just listeners. We were observers. And that difference was irreversible. As sleep slowly came, I remember thinking, if a voice can guide an entire village, then what happens when that voice hesitates? Do we follow it more carefully? Or do we begin, for the first time, to listen to something else? Even if that something else is only silence. After the day the radio was wrong, nothing changed immediately. That was the most unsettling part. Life continued almost exactly the same. The same routines, the same waiting, the same careful attention to every crackle from the wooden box in the corner of our homes. But something inside people had quietly shifted. Not broken, not fixed, just loosened, like a knot that had held too tightly for too long, finally beginning to relax. In the days that followed, I started noticing small differences in how adults behaved. My father still checked the radio every morning, but now he paused slightly longer before acting on what it implied. My mother still followed instructions, but sometimes her eyes would drift away mid-task, as if she was thinking about something that did not come from the radio at all. And in the village, conversations began to sound slightly different again. Not louder, not more chaotic, but uncertain. People no longer repeated instructions exactly as they were given. They interpreted them, softly, carefully, as if testing whether interpretation was still allowed. One afternoon, I overheard two neighbors speaking near the well. One of them said, "It didn't happen when they said it would." The other replied, "Maybe it still will." There was no argument, just two different ways of holding uncertainty. And I remember realizing something very clearly in that moment. We were no longer fully inside the radio's certainty, but we weren't outside it either. We were somewhere in between. That in-between space felt strange, like standing in a doorway where both rooms are familiar, but neither fully belongs to you anymore. That evening, the radio spoke again. Its voice was normal, calm, structured. It gave instructions about maintaining readiness and continuing standard precautions. But the reaction in the village was no longer automatic. People listened and then paused, just briefly. A small hesitation that didn't exist before. My father turned the radio off after the broadcast and sat quietly for a long time. Then he said something I had never heard him say before. "Sometimes I think we follow it before we understand it." He didn't say it angrily. He didn't say it loudly. It sounded more like he was thinking out loud than making a statement. But it changed something in the room. Because until that moment, the idea of understanding had not really been part of our listening. We listened to respond, not to interpret. That night, I lay in bed thinking about that word, understand. It felt unfamiliar in the context of instructions, as if understanding belonged to something slower, something more personal, something the radio did not fully allow. In the days that followed, I noticed another shift. People began to double-check things, not just the radio, but each other. "Did you hear the same thing I did? Is that what it said exactly?" Small questions like that started appearing in everyday conversation, not as doubt, but as confirmation seeking. And slowly, without anyone deciding it consciously, the village began to rebuild something it had quietly lost: personal judgment. It was fragile at first, almost hesitant, like learning to walk again after relying on something else for too long. The radio still held authority. No one rejected it. No one ignored it. But it was no longer the only voice that existed in our decisions. One evening, I remember my mother standing by the window longer than usual after a broadcast. She didn't move immediately. She just watched the sky outside. Then she said softly, almost to herself, "I think we forgot how to pause before listening." That sentence stayed with me because it wasn't about the war. It wasn't about danger. It was about us. The way we had begun to react before we reflected. That night, the radio remained silent longer than usual. And instead of feeling uneasy, I noticed something different. People in our home did not rush to turn it on. We simply waited, not because we were told to, but because we were choosing to. And that small difference felt larger than anything that had happened so far. As I drifted toward sleep, I remember thinking, maybe thinking for yourself is not something that disappears all at once. Maybe it fades slowly in the space between instruction and action, until one day you realize You are waiting again. But this time, not for a voice, just for your own moment to decide. It happened without warning, and at first, we didn't understand what we were hearing because it wasn't sound that changed. It was the absence of it. The radio, which had become a constant presence in our home and in the entire village, did not turn on that evening. Not at the usual time, not a little later, not even with its familiar crackle that usually announced it was about to speak. It simply stayed silent. At first, no one reacted, because silence had become normal between broadcasts. We assumed it would come soon. My mother continued preparing dinner. My father checked the wick of the lamp. I sat near the table listening, not for fear yet, but for routine. But minutes passed, then more, and slowly something began to shift in the house. Not panic, not movement, but attention. The kind of attention that slowly grows when something expected does not arrive. My father finally walked to the radio and turned the knob. Nothing, no static, no voice, just empty stillness. He tried again. Still nothing. That was when he paused, and I remember seeing something in his face I had never seen before. Not fear exactly, but uncertainty without instruction. Because until that moment, uncertainty always had a solution. Wait for the broadcast. Listen again. Follow what comes next. But now there was no next. Only silence. Outside, I noticed something strange through the window. A few neighbors had stepped outside their homes, not rushing, not shouting, just standing, looking toward each other as if trying to confirm that what they were experiencing was real. No one knew what to do first, because for the first time in a long time, there was no shared voice telling us how to respond. My brother whispered, "Is it broken?" My mother didn't answer immediately, not because she didn't know, but because the question itself felt too simple for what we were feeling. Eventually, she said softly, "Maybe it will come back." But even she didn't sound sure. As the night deepened, the silence became heavier. Not because it grew louder, but because it had no interruption. Normally, even between broadcasts, there was expectation. But now, expectation had nowhere to go. It just stayed in the air, unresolved. Around us, the village was changing in real time. I could see faint lights moving between houses, people checking on each other, not with urgency, but with hesitation, as if unsure whether speaking too loudly might break something invisible. At one point, my father stepped outside. I followed him quietly. The air felt different, not physically, but emotionally, like the village had lost its center of gravity. A few men stood near the road, talking in low voices. No one had clear information. No one had instructions. And that was the most unsettling part. We were not afraid of danger. We were afraid of not knowing how to respond to it. After some time, my father said something very quietly, almost to himself. "We're waiting for a voice that isn't coming, That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else that night, because it was the first time someone named what we were doing. Waiting, not for news, not for instructions, but for permission to feel stable again. Back inside the house, no one slept easily. We lay down, but rest did not come properly. Every small sound felt amplified. The wind, the wooden frame of the house, the distant movement of other homes doing the same thing. But underneath all of it was something deeper. The realization that silence itself could become a kind of presence. Not comforting, not threatening, just undeniable. At some point before dawn, I thought I heard a faint crackle from the radio. My father immediately stood up. We all froze, listening, waiting, but it didn't return. Just one moment of possibility, and then nothing again. And strangely, that was worse than complete silence, because it reminded us what we had lost. Not information, but certainty. As I finally drifted toward sleep that night, I remember thinking something I could not fully understand at the time. When a voice guides your world for long enough, you don't just miss the voice when it disappears. You miss the version of yourself that only existed while listening. And in that silence, I realized something quietly frightening. We were no longer waiting for instructions. We were waiting to remember how to think without them. The morning after the silence, nothing felt like morning. The sun still rose the same way it always did over our village, soft, pale light touching the rooftops, slowly revealing the familiar shapes of houses and trees. But something essential was missing from the day. Not sound, not movement, but direction. The radio remained silent. No crackle, no static, no voice. And by now, we had all stopped pretending it would come any moment. Instead, we had begun living inside the gap it left behind. That morning, people moved differently in the village. Not quickly, not slowly, but uncertainly, as if every action required reconsideration. My father went outside early. I followed him again, staying slightly behind. The air was cold in a way I had not noticed before. Not physically colder, but emotionally empty, like something had been removed from it. Near the center of the village, small groups had formed. People were talking more than they had in months, but their voices were different. No one spoke with confidence. Everyone spoke in fragments. Do you think it's coming back? No one knows. It must be temporary. Maybe they will fix it. Every sentence ended without landing anywhere solid. It felt like watching people try to rebuild something invisible using only questions. I remember standing near my father as he listened to others speak. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer answers. And that was new. Because before, even uncertainty had been organized by the radio. Now uncertainty belonged only to us. At one point, an older man in the group said something quietly. We are more afraid now than when it was speaking. No one disagreed, because it was true. Not because silence was dangerous, but because silence removed structure. And without structure, even safe things felt unfamiliar. I began noticing something deeper that day. People were not afraid of the radio anymore. They were afraid of what had replaced it. Their own thoughts, their own interpretations, their own responsibility. In the afternoon, I sat alone near the steps of our house. The village was unusually still, but not calm. Stillness without instruction feels different. It feels like waiting for something you cannot name. I found myself listening for the radio without meaning to. Not consciously, not intentionally, just instinctively. And that was when I understood something important. The radio had not just given us information. It had trained our attention. Even now, without sound, we were still listening for it. That evening, my mother sat beside me and said something quietly. It feels strange not knowing what to do next. I nodded because I felt it too. But what I didn't say, what I couldn't say yet, was that part of me almost preferred knowing what to do, even if I hadn't chosen it. That realization made me uncomfortable, so I stayed quiet. Later that night, the village gathered again near the center. Not formally, not instructed, just drawn together. People shared what little they knew, or thought they knew, or hoped might be true. But slowly, something shifted in the atmosphere. Not resolution, but acceptance. We were no longer waiting for a voice to return. We were beginning to understand it might not. And in that understanding, something very fragile appeared. Not freedom exactly, but responsibility. The idea that if nothing tells you what to do next, then you must begin to decide it yourself. It didn't feel empowering at first. It felt heavy, like carrying something unfamiliar after years of being told where to place your hands. That night, I lay in bed listening to the house. The wind outside moved through the trees differently now. Without the radio's presence, even nature felt less organized. Or maybe we had just stopped assigning it meaning through instruction. Before falling asleep, I remember thinking very softly, silence is not empty. It is just unassigned. And for the first time in a long time, we were no longer being told what it meant. We had to decide that ourselves, slowly, quietly, together, or alone. And in that uncertainty, we were finally outside the voice that had shaped us for so long, but also no longer inside anything that could hold us, just somewhere in between, learning, for the first time, how to listen without being told what we are hearing. We didn't notice the end of the war the way people often imagine it in stories. There was no sudden explosion of celebration in our village, no instant relief, no clear moment where everything simply turned into peace. Instead, there was change, slow, careful, almost uncertain, as if even history itself was unsure how to announce what came next. The radio had still not fully returned to its old rhythm. But one morning, something different happened. A crackle, faint, then a voice. Not the same voice we had grown used to during the most difficult years. This one sounded less sharp, less controlled, more human. At first, no one reacted strongly, because we had learned caution even around hope. My father turned the knob slowly, as if afraid that moving too quickly might break it again. And then we listened. The words were different now. They spoke less about warnings and more about updates, less about instructions and more about conditions changing. It didn't feel like an order anymore. It felt like information. And that difference was larger than it should have been. Outside, the village did not immediately celebrate. People simply stood in doorways, listening, trying to understand what kind of world they were now allowed to live in. My mother sat very still that morning, her hands resting in her lap. And after a long silence, she said something softly. It doesn't sound the same anymore. And she was right. It didn't. The voice that had once defined our fear, our timing, our silence, now sounded like something that no longer needed to control us. But strangely, that did not immediately feel like relief. It felt like adjustment. That day, the radio spoke several times, each broadcast softer than the last years of war, less urgent, less structured, almost like it was learning how to speak without shaping behavior. And with each broadcast, something in the village shifted again, not back to how it was before, but forward into something unfamiliar. People began speaking a little more freely, not loudly, but without checking the air first. Children started playing outside a bit longer. Adults still listened to the radio, but no longer with the same tension in their shoulders. It was still important, but it was no longer absolute. I remember walking with my brother that afternoon. He looked around the village and said something simple. Why does everything feel quieter, even when people are talking? I didn't know how to answer him, because he was right. The world had become quieter in a different way, not because there was less sound, but because there was less fear attached to it. That evening, the radio announced something that made my father sit down slowly. The war, in words that were careful and indirect, was being described as approaching conclusion in many places. No celebration, no certainty, just transition. And yet, even without full clarity, something in the village began to soften. Not joy, not disbelief, but release. A loosening of something that had been held too tightly for too long. That night, I noticed something I had not seen in years. People were not waiting for instructions anymore. They were listening, and then deciding what to do with what they heard. That difference was small, but it changed everything. Before sleep, I stood near the window. The air outside felt different again. Not lighter exactly, but less structured. Like the world was no longer being held in place by a single voice. And I realized something quietly profound. We had spent so long listening for guidance that we had forgotten what it felt like to simply interpret the world ourselves. And